They called it Hope Haven Youth Center, a name painted in soft blue letters on a wooden sign by the road. From the outside, it looked like something from a church flyer. White walls, a small playground buried under snow, and a banner that read, "Caring for Lost Children." People in town dropped off donated coats and canned food every winter. They thought the place was a blessing. Ethan Miller knew better. At 14, Ethan had learned the difference between words and truth. Hope Haven talked about love, discipline, and second chances. Inside, it was cold. Cold in ways that had nothing to do with weather. Meals were small, smiles were rare, and punishment came quietly behind locked doors. That night, the wind screamed across the fields like it was trying to tear the building apart. Snow rattled against the windows in sharp, nervous bursts. The other boys were already lying on their bunks, wrapped in thin blankets that smelled like bleach and damp wool. Ethan was still awake. His hands stung from scrubbing the kitchen floor with icy water. His stomach twisted with hunger. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and watched the yard disappear under drifting snow. Earlier that evening, he'd been accused of stealing an extra roll from the pantry. He hadn't done it, but that didn't matter. "You want to learn gratitude?" Mr. Grayson had said, his voice calm and heavy like a locked door. "You can think about it outside." So they made Ethan stand in the backyard, boots sinking into fresh snow, while the wind clawed through his jacket. 10 minutes, then 20. His legs went numb. His teeth rattled so hard he thought they might crack. That was when the memory came back. Not of Hope Haven, of his grandfather Jack. Jack had lived in a weather-beaten cabin near the woods, the kind with a crooked porch and the smoke that always smelled like pine. He used to say things that sounded simple but stayed with you. "Cold don't kill you," Jack would tell him. "Wind does. First thing you do is hide from it." Jack had taught him how to stack rocks for warmth, how to read animal tracks, how to make a fire pit that wouldn't choke you with smoke. Back then, Ethan thought it was just old man talk. Standing in the snow, shaking and dizzy, he understood it was something else. It was a way out. When they finally let him back inside, his fingers were pale and stiff. Nobody asked if he was okay. Nobody noticed when he didn't eat his dinner. That night, lying on his bunk, Ethan listened to the wind hammer the walls. The heater coughed and went quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a boy was crying into his pillow. Ethan stared at the cracked ceiling and made a decision that scared him more than the cold ever had. If he stayed, winter would finish what the place had started. He slid his feet into his boots and reached under the mattress. All he had was a thin blanket, a rusted pocket knife, and half a loaf of bread wrapped in paper. The back door groaned when he opened it. Snow rushed in like a living thing. The yard was empty. The road was gone, buried under white. Ethan pulled his hood up and stepped into the storm. Behind him, Hope Haven glowed weakly through the snow. Warm light, kind words, and a promise that meant nothing. Ahead of him was darkness, wind, and a mountain he barely knew. And somewhere in that white silence, the voice of his grandfather seemed to whisper, "Find the rocks, block the wind, stay alive." The cold hit Ethan the moment the door closed behind him. Not the sharp kind that stings and wakes you up, but the deep, heavy kind that settles into your bones like it plans to stay. Snow swallowed his boots with every step, soft on top and hard underneath, like the ground itself had turned against him. The lights of Hope Haven faded fast. First they blurred, then they vanished completely, replaced by a wide, empty darkness and the sound of wind tearing across open land. Ethan didn't have a map. He didn't even have a real plan. He just walked. The road was gone, buried under drifts. Fence posts leaned at strange angles, half swallowed by white. The sky glowed faintly, a dull gray that made everything look the same. Trees, hills, clouds, all melting into one endless shape. His lungs burned. His fingers went numb inside his sleeves. The bread in his pocket felt like a brick of ice. "Don't stop," he told himself. "Stopping is how people disappear." After a while, he didn't know how long, his legs started to shake. Every step felt heavier than the last. The wind came in waves, slamming into his chest and pushing him sideways, like a hand that didn't care where he landed. That was when he saw the rocks. A dark shape rose out of the hillside ahead, jagged and uneven. Not a house, not a barn, just stone, piled high like something ancient that had been there long before roads or buildings. Ethan stumbled toward it. Up close, he saw a narrow opening near the base, half hidden by snow and brush. The wind screamed past the entrance, but inside, it sounded different, softer, like the storm was tired of fighting. He crawled in on his hands and knees. The air inside the cave was still cold, but it wasn't biting. The walls felt dry under his fingers. The ground sloped slightly upward toward the back, and the ceiling lowered like it was trying to protect whatever stayed inside. Ethan collapsed against the stone and pulled his blanket around his shoulders. His teeth wouldn't stop chattering. For a long moment, all he could do was breathe and listen. To the wind outside, to his heart thudding in his ears, to the strange quiet that lived deeper in the rock. Then his grandfather's voice came back to him, as clear as if Jack were sitting beside him. "Wind is the enemy," Jack used to say. "You don't fight it, you hide from it." Ethan looked toward the cave mouth where snow blew past like smoke. Hide from it, he thought. He crawled farther in, toward the higher end of the cave. The air felt steadier there, warmer somehow. Not warm like a house, but not deadly either. He curled up, pressing his back to the stone. His boots were soaked. His pants were stiff with ice. But the rock behind him didn't steal his heat the way the wind had. Outside, the storm howled like something alive. Inside, there was only his breathing. Fear crept in slowly. What if someone found him? What if the cave flooded? What if wolves came? His stomach twisted with hunger, but he forced himself to take small bites of bread, chewing slowly like Jack had taught him. "Stretch it," his grandfather used to say. "Tomorrow always needs something too." Ethan pulled his blanket tighter and stared into the dark. He thought of Hope Haven, the locked doors, the cold punishments, the words about kindness that never matched the actions. He thought of standing in the yard while snow soaked through his clothes. And then he thought of this place. It wasn't safe, it wasn't warm, but it wasn't hurting him. For the first time that night, something inside his chest loosened. "I can stay here," he whispered to the rock. "Just for tonight." The wind roared outside, angry and wild. But deep in the cave, the sound faded into a distant, restless murmur. And in that narrow pocket of stone and silence, Ethan made a promise to himself. He wouldn't go back. Not to the building that called itself mercy. Not to the place that taught him pain. If winter wanted him, it would have to come into the cave and take him. And somehow, with the memory of his grandfather guiding his thoughts, Ethan believed he could make sure it never did. Ethan woke up to silence. Not the kind you hear in a bedroom at night, but a deep, heavy quiet that felt carved into the stone itself. The wind was still raging outside, but inside the cave it sounded distant, like it was happening in another world. His body ached. His boots were stiff with ice. When he breathed, a small cloud formed in front of his face. Still alive, he thought. That had to count for something. He sat up slowly and pressed his palm against the rock wall. It felt cold, but steady. Not sharp, not cruel. The cave hadn't tried to steal his warmth the way the wind had. His grandfather's voice returned, uninvited but welcome. "Rock don't change much," Jack used to say. "That's why you trust it. Weather lies, stone tells the truth." Ethan pushed himself to his feet and moved toward the entrance. Snow had drifted halfway inside during the night, piling up in a crooked ridge. The wind rushed past the opening, fast and violent, but didn't reach the back of the cave. He studied it the way Jack had taught him to study the woods. Where does the cold come in? Where does the air move? Where does it stop? The answer was clear. The mouth of the cave was killing him. The back of it was saving him. So he started working. He dragged in fallen branches from the edge of the hillside, his hands burning as feeling slowly returned. He wedged the thickest ones upright near the entrance, forming a loose wall. Smaller sticks filled the gaps. Then he packed snow and dirt against it until the wind stopped slicing straight through. The cave grew quieter. His breath didn't turn to ice as fast. "That's step one," he muttered, pretending Jack could hear him. "Block the wind." Next came the floor. The ground was frozen hard, sucking heat from his bones. He tore pine needles from low branches and piled them in the back of the cave, making a rough bed. Over that, he spread his thin blanket. It wasn't much, but it was better than bare stone. His stomach growled. He took one more small bite of bread and forced himself to stop. "Half now, half later," Jack had said. "You don't eat like you're scared. You eat like you plan to be here tomorrow." Ethan nodded at the empty cave like someone was watching. Then came the fire. This part scared him. He remembered Jack warning him about smoke, about caves turning into traps if you weren't careful. "Fire needs air," his grandfather used to say, "and smoke needs a way out. Otherwise, it'll take your place." Ethan dug a shallow pit near the entrance, where cold air still moved. He lined it with flat stones and built a narrow channel upward with smaller rocks. guiding smoke toward a crack in the ceiling he hadn't noticed before. It took him 3 tries to spark the flame. His fingers were clumsy, slow with cold and fear. When the fire finally caught, it felt like a miracle. Not big, not wild, just enough to glow and breathe. He fed it twigs and watched the smoke slide along the stone and drift outside instead of into his lungs. Warmth crept across the cave in quiet waves. Not comfort, but survival. By nightfall, the difference was proof enough. The back of the cave stayed warmer. The wind no longer reached him. The rock behind his shoulders held on to the day's heat like it didn't want to let go. Ethan leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. "I'm doing it," he whispered, "like you showed me." In the darkness, he imagined Jack sitting on a stump, nodding with that crooked smile. Outside, the temperature dropped again. The storm kept tearing across the mountain like it had something personal to prove. Inside the cave, a boy sat beside a small fire, counting his breaths and marking the first day he had ever survived on his own. He scratched a line into the stone with his pocket knife. Day 1. Not rescued, not safe, but still here. And that was enough to keep going. The storm didn't end. It grew teeth. By the 4th night, the wind came in long, furious waves, hammering the mountainside like it wanted inside the cave. Snow didn't fall anymore. It flew sideways, scraping the rock like sandpaper. Ethan kept the fire small and steady, feeding it the last of the twigs he'd gathered before the cold locked the world down. He was crouched near the pit, rubbing his hands together, when he heard it. A sound that wasn't wind. A cough. Faint, broken, human. Ethan froze. The noise came again, closer this time, mixed with something like a cry that had been torn apart by cold air. He grabbed his pocket knife, not because it could protect him, but because it made him feel less like a child. He crawled toward the entrance. A shape collapsed just outside the wall of branches he'd built. Then another. 2 small figures, wrapped in thin coats already stiff with ice. "Help, please," one of them whispered. Ethan dragged them inside with shaking arms. They were boys, about his age. One had a split lip crusted with blood. The other's eyelashes were white with frost. "Hope Haven," the taller one said through chattering teeth. "They said we ran, but we just couldn't stay." Ethan's chest tightened. He fed the fire, wrapped his blanket around their shoulders, forced warm snow water into their mouths the way Jack had once shown him. Slow, careful, patient. When their color came back, the truth spilled out. They'd been punished for sneaking food, locked in the storage shed overnight. When the door didn't open in the morning, they broke a window and ran. They followed the ridge until they saw smoke curling from stone. "You made this?" the shorter boy asked, staring at the walls, the fire pit, the blocked wind. "I just listened to my grandpa," Ethan said. They stayed. 2 nights later, a girl showed up. Then another boy. Each of them thin. Each of them carrying the same story in different words. Same place, same cold punishments, same escape. By the end of the week, 5 kids were sleeping in the back of the cave, lined up like pieces of driftwood. They took turns feeding the fire, gathering sticks during the brief calm hours, sharing the last crumbs of bread and whatever roots Ethan could dig out of the frozen ground. Word moved quietly the way fear always does. The cave became a secret. Down in town, Hope Haven told everyone the children had run away because they were troubled. Posters went up with smiling photos that didn't match the faces Ethan saw beside the fire. One afternoon, the wind eased enough for sound to travel. Ethan heard voices outside. Adult voices. Searchers. He pressed the kids deeper into the cave and pulled the tarp over the entrance. They held their breath while boots crunched past, close enough to smell wet wool and gasoline. "Probably froze," one man said. "Kids don't last long in storms like this." The footsteps faded. Nobody moved for a long time. That night, the storm came back harder than before. Snow packed into the hills. Trees snapped under the weight. The world shrank to rock and fire and the sound of breathing. One of the boys, Caleb, started crying quietly into his sleeve. "I thought they were supposed to help us," he said. "They had a cross on the wall." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He just poked the fire and said, "My grandpa said love isn't what you say. It's what you don't make people survive." The words surprised him when they came out. The cave grew warmer with bodies and breath and shared fear. The stone held their heat the way it held the fire's warmth, steady and stubborn. Outside, the storm swallowed roads, fences, and lies. Inside, 5 kids sat close together in the dark, learning something none of them had been taught before. This wasn't just a place to hide. It was proof they had been right to run. And somewhere beyond the storm, the truth was still waiting to be found. Spring came quietly, not with birds or warm sunshine at first, but with silence. One morning, Ethan woke up and realized the wind had stopped screaming. The cave felt different, lighter somehow, like it was finally allowed to breathe. Water dripped from the stone ceiling. Snow outside began to sink instead of rise. They waited 2 more days before anyone dared step out. The mountain looked wounded. Trees bent low. Fences lay buried. The trail they had followed was nothing but a crooked white scar across the hillside. They should have felt scared. Instead, they felt brave. That afternoon, a man on a snowmobile saw smoke drifting from the rocks and stopped. When he found 5 thin kids wrapped in blankets beside a stone fire pit, he stared like he'd found ghosts. "You kids, where did you come from?" he asked. Ethan didn't lie. He told him about Hope Haven, about the cold punishments, about the shed with the locked door, about running into the storm because staying felt worse. By the next day, sheriff's trucks were crawling up the road. Social workers came. Doctors came. People with notebooks and worried faces came. When the adults saw the bruises, the frostbitten toes, the way the kids flinched at loud voices, the story changed. Hope Haven didn't look so hopeful anymore. The center was shut down within a week. People in town argued about how they hadn't known. Some said they trusted the wrong people. Others said they should have asked better questions. But the cave didn't argue. It just stood there solid and quiet the way it always had. They called it the Miller Shelter, after Ethan's grandfather, the man who had taught a boy how to listen to stone and block the wind. Ethan didn't live in the cave after that. None of them did. They were placed in homes where food came on plates and heat came from vents in the wall. But sometimes when the sky went gray, Ethan thought about the sound of fire against rock and how it felt to be safe without locks. He visited the cave once that summer. The fire pit was still there. The wall of branches had fallen in. The floor was scattered with old pine needles and small carvings in stone. He touched the first mark he'd scratched into the wall. Day 1. Back then, survival had meant not freezing. Now it meant something else. It meant telling the truth. It meant believing kids when they say they're hurting. It meant understanding that love isn't a sign on a building. It's what happens when no one is watching. Ethan stood at the entrance and let the warm air brush his face. "My grandpa saved me," he whispered, "even after he was gone." And maybe that's the real story here. Not just about a boy who ran into the snow. Not just about a cave that kept children alive, but about how the right words taught at the right time can echo louder than fear. So here's a question for you. If you were Ethan, would you have had the courage to run, or would you have stayed and hoped things changed? And if you were one of the adults in that town, would you have believed the sign on the wall, or the children standing in the cold? Stories like this remind us why paying attention matters, why listening matters, and why survival isn't always about strength. Sometimes it's about remembering who taught you how to live. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more powerful survival stories and forgotten lessons from the past. Because some truths are too important to stay buried in the snow.